Good day. Yesterday was an extraordinarily complicated day in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, with lots of reports flooding in late evening about what was going on in and around Bakhmut, with some reports suggesting that a major Ukrainian offensive in Bakhmut was underway, that Russian forces had collapsed, their defenses had collapsed, that the Ukrainians had broken through, and then all kinds of denials from the Russians and further claims from Prigozhin and others of further advances by the Wagner forces in Bakhmut itself. In the meantime, massive missile strikes and bombing strikes by the Russian Air Force across Ukraine over the course of the night. Well, what did in fact happen? And I'm going to say straight away that, again, as I'm discussing all of these events from far away London and have no access to people directly on the ground, I can't actually be sure. There's a wide discrepancy in reports, with some Russian commentators coming perilously close, in my opinion, to implying that nothing happened of any significance at all last night. I don't believe that that is indeed the case, and I'm going to just, first of all, try to reconstruct, or at least provide a timeline for what the various reports were saying, most of which, it should be said straight away, originated in Russian telegram channels. The Ukrainians, as is invariably the case, said absolutely nothing whilst in the early hours of whatever operational offensive or attack they were conducting. So what did actually happen last night? Well, first of all, most of yesterday, there was actually very little information coming out of what was going on in Bakhmut and in the areas round about at all. There were a few scattered reports of further Russian advances, but there was very little information indeed. And then, as I said, as the day passed and we began to move into the evening, we got a multiplicity of reports, all of which appeared at roughly the same time, of the Ukrainians making multiple attacks in various directions along the flanks of Bakhmut, in the surrounding areas, both in the north and in the south. And there were reports that the Ukrainians had achieved some breakthroughs. And these reports, which I strongly suspect originated from one source, though I can't, of course, confirm this, but all of these reports were picked up by various channels, telegram channels, which busily started to repeat them. And for some period of time, about an hour, perhaps a little longer, something close to panic started to take hold. And in this atmosphere of panic, there were more reports of other events, and they started to extend not just from Russian telegram channels but also into the Russian mainstream media. So Redovka now started to publish some of these later reports, and they spoke of a general Ukrainian offensive being underway. There were reports of major movements of Ukrainian troops to the border of Russia in Kharkiv region. Long columns of tanks and armored vehicles were supposed to be advancing towards Kharkiv region. There were also reports of major concentrations of Ukrainian troops in Zaporozhye preparing to go on the attack, and of boats being assembled on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, with a crossing of the Dnieper also supposedly about to take place. And as I said, for a short time, there was an atmosphere of excitement and, well, straightforward panic in some cases. people seem to be repeating these reports to each other and acting as if they were true. And then the mood suddenly began to shift, because reports started to come from various Russian military reporters who started to deny that these reports were at all accurate. The first came from some Russian military journalist who was in contact with Russian troops in a place called Mayosk, which supposedly was the target of some kind of Ukrainian attack last night. He reported that the attack was just a reconnaissance in force, that just 4 infantry fighting vehicles had been involved, and that the Ukrainians, far from achieving any kind of breakthrough in the area, had been repelled. And then we got more reports from other people, including our old friends, Vladimir Rogov in Zaporozhye region, and Sladko, the acting governor of the Russian-controlled areas of Kherson region. Both of them came back and said that there was actually no fighting going on in their regions, no sign of any unusual troop movements on the part of Ukraine, that the situation in Zaporozhye and Kherson was relatively quiet. And then we got more reports from Lugansk region and the area of the Svatovo-Kremenaya battles, where there'd also been some claims that the Ukrainians had gone on the offensive. And again, people who appeared to have access to information from the ground began to deny that these reports were true. The situation hadn't changed. The situation remained quiet overall. And then we got, out of the blue, early this morning, a statement from the Russian Defense Ministry. And I'm going to read it. This is a machine translation. The official translation from the Russian Defense Ministry of this statement, which was made at 23:05 hours Moscow time last night. Anyway, late in the evening. Anyway, this report, the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet published its official English translation, but the machine report, I'm sure, is the machine translation, I think, probably gets the situation fairly accurately. And it says this: statements circulated by individual Telegram channels about defense breakthroughs, in other words, Ukrainian breakthroughs, that took place in various parts of the contact line, do not correspond to reality. As of May 11th, 2023, at 2200 hours, again, I'm assuming that's Moscow time, no active operations are underway in the Kupiansk direction, that is to say, in Kharkiv region. During the day, the Western group of forces stopped the actions of 3 enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups in the area. Now, this is small groups of about 10 men, usually, fairly small groups, but obviously limited fighting, nothing particularly different from what regularly takes place in this war. And then it goes on to say, the statement says, in the Krasno-Limansky direction, the group of troops center repelled 2 attacks by company tactical groups of the Ukrainian armed forces in the settlements of Kremenaya and Chervonaya Dibrova. So again, this is the kind of thing that goes on all the time in the battle, in this war, in this conflict. Each side advances from time to time, but company tactical groups, I'm guessing, perhaps around 100 men total. There were 2 such attacks, 200 men perhaps went on the attack. Probably by now, the size of these Ukrainian companies is less than what one might expect, but anyway, hardly a major offensive in the area of Liman, which is of course in northern Donetsk region, connects with the fighting in southern Kharkiv region and northern Lugansk region as well. And then we come back to the next and the most important area, which is the area around Bakhmut. It says in the Donetsk direction, 3 attempts by Ukraine to conduct reconnaissance in force were thwarted, and 8 attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine on the positions of the Russian troops were successfully repelled. Assault detachments continued to liberate the western part of Artyomovsk with the support of aviation and artillery. Artyomovsk is, of course, Bakhmut, and the assault detachments are the Wagner organization. And then the report, the statement, this statement that appeared at, as I said, 11 o'clock evening time, Moscow, 2300 hours Moscow time, finishes by saying subdivisions of the southern group of troops are actively blockading Avdiivka and capturing Marinka. We'll come to that in a moment. Currently, a battle is underway to repel an attack by a unit of the armed forces of Ukraine in the direction of the settlement of Malo-Ilinovka. Army and assault aviation, as well as artillery, are involved. The enemy suffers significant losses in manpower and equipment. There are no active operations. And then the report finishes, in the Zaporozhye and Kherson directions, the general situation is there are no active operations in the Zaporozhye and Kherson directions. And then the report finishes, the general situation in the area of the special military operation is under control. Anyway, after that, there was a wave of relief across Russian telegram channels, the same people who were either panicking or close to panic or trying to reassure people who were panicking on these telegram channels came out and started to say, calm down, all is well. There was even some elements of levity, which perhaps reflect the tension of the previous few hours. And then this morning, London time, afternoon, Moscow time, there's been yet another statement from the Russian Defense Ministry. It says, it's a rather more detailed account of what happened in and around Bakhmut yesterday. And it says, the report says that, and again, this is essentially a machine translation. Ukraine launched 1,000 troops with 40 tanks and other equipment into an offensive near Bakhmut. In the Soledar direction, the enemy yesterday carried out offensive operations along the entire line of contact between the parties, more than 95 kilometers long. Now, the Russians tend to refer to the area around Bakhmut as the Soledar direction, 95-kilometer front, 1,000 Ukrainian troops and 40 tanks and other equipment along this entire line. It doesn't seem to me like the kind of operation that would involve enough troops to carry out a breakthrough. But anyway, to continue, Ukraine launched 26 attacks, and all attacks by enemy forces have been repelled. Breakthroughs in the defense of the Russian army were not allowed. The subdivisions of the South group of forces occupied the line, taking into account the favorable conditions of the Berkhovsky Reservoir in the Malo-Ilinovsky direction to increase the stability of the defense. And then the report concludes more than 540 Ukrainian troops, 8 tanks, and more than 20 units of other armoured vehicles were destroyed. And it's suggested that in total around 900 Ukrainian troops were killed or wounded in the battle, which, by the way, I am sure is an exaggeration. It would imply that the entire 1,004-man force that was committed to this fight was essentially wiped out, which I hardly believe. But anyway, it then finishes the soldiers. This is the report from the Russian Defense Ministry. The soldiers of the 4th and 200th Motorized Rifle Brigades, Army aviation pilots, and other units showed themselves, acted courageously, repelling the enemy attacks. So that's the official line from the Russian Defense Ministry. There were attacks yesterday by the Ukrainian forces in and around Bakhmut. They involved around 1,000 men in total, but this is over a 95-kilometer area. There's been some maps that have been published by some people which appear to show Ukrainian advances or attempted advances, specifically in 3 locations to the north and south of Bakhmut. As I said, around 1,000 men, 40 armoured vehicles. The attack was supposedly repelled with heavy losses, and most of the armoured vehicles were destroyed. Is this true? Well, I see no reason to think that, in essence, it isn't true. Perhaps, as I said, in fact, I'm sure that the Russians are exaggerating the extent of the losses that they inflicted, but it doesn't seem as if the Ukrainians last night did achieve any breakthrough in these attacks. Now, I'm going to qualify that in a moment because, of course, we've had comments about the whole situation from Prigozhin. But anyway, that is what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. And usually, when they report things like this, they tend to report things in this kind of detail. Those reports tend to be reasonably accurate or fairly accurate about the overall situation, even if, as I said, we shouldn't take too seriously some of the claims about the losses on Ukraine that they claim to inflict. There's been a very wise and sensible comment by a Swedish commentator, Mikael Valtersson, who's an important commentator in the war. He tweets regularly. He's a former officer in the Swedish Armed Forces, in the air defense, former defense politician and chief of staff of the Swedish Democrats. So he's quite a reputable commentator, and I found much of what he says reasonably accurate. And he puts it like this. This is a tweet that he's put out this morning, quite a lengthy one. He says, "It has been an interesting day. Today," means yesterday, "among Russian war bloggers and media, a lot of rumors were spread. These rumors became worse and worse. After a short time, there was actually some kind of a panic. Many different sources said that the Ukrainian military had started the counteroffensive and broken through Russian defense lines in many places, and that Bakhmut was encircled by the Ukrainians. All these rumors were strengthened by the way Russian media and bloggers use Telegram. Everyone shares each other's information, so together this can create a storm of false information. During the evening, Russian bloggers and media suddenly realized that nothing extraordinary was actually happening. There were a lot of Ukrainian probing attacks all along the front, more than usual, but nothing on a large scale. So the panic subsided, and everybody laughed, relieved at all the others who fell for the rumours, even if they had also themselves fallen victim to the same panic. The reality is that yesterday and last night, Ukrainian forces made some progress southwest of Bakhmut, north of Khromovo. They took a minor area east of Bogdanivka. The Russian armed forces, on the other hand, captured a small area north of Khromovo, substantial areas of southwest Bakhmut, and some either minor areas west of Kruta Balka on the eastern part of Avdiivka. But today, no changes on the front, major changes on the front have been reported. And he then goes on to say, from the Wagner Group came the usual claims of the capture of 60,000 square meters of territory without specific area specifications. That, by the way, I'm going to come back to. That's clearly a reference to the totality of Bakhmut, which the Russians claim that they have under control. And then Valterson makes what I think is an entirely valid point. The most interesting thing today was the nervousness of many Russian bloggers and journalists. Had they been more sure of themselves, they wouldn't have fallen prey so easily to the panic. I believe many are disappointed by the lack of advance of the Russian armed forces during the winter, and albeit that they hope that the stalemate at the front is due to the successful Russian attrition warfare, they still doubt it a bit, fearing that the real reason is the ineptitude in the Russian military. Many on the Russian side probably need one clear, undisputed victory to become less nervous. Until then, new panic might again very well appear regularly. I repeat the famous phrase from the Russian-Turkish War in 1877, everything is calm at Shipka, at least one more time. By the way, the battle in 1877 that Valterson is referring to is a very, very important battle, very famous to anybody who lives in the Balkans, as the Russian army fought a war against Turkey from basically 1876 to 1878. The two key battles were a battle to capture a fortified Turkish city called, Bulgarian city, fortified by the Turks who were at that time occupying Bulgaria, called Plevna. And that's a major battle, which, as I said, is largely unknown in the West, and which has some similarities to the Battle of Donbass, but I'm not going to get drawn into this discussion now. And a successful Russian offensive that captured the Shipka Pass, which was the battle which basically brought about the eventual Russian victory in that prolonged and very difficult war that the Russians fought. But, I'm not going to get sidetracked into the history here. But I think that Valterson's point about the nervousness of some Russian military bloggers is true. And I think it has actually two causes. I don't think they're just about the failure of the Russian army to carry out big arrow offensives over the course of the winter. I think it's still an echo of the shock many Russian military reporters and bloggers felt over the course of the autumn in the face of Ukraine's offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region. Those offensives had not been expected by much of this blogging community, and they are still somehow dismayed by these and have been made very nervous by them. And secondly, it's important to remember that some of these people who blog on these Telegram channels are anyway predisposed to be bitterly critical and hostile to the Russian political and military authorities, whom they feel are nowhere near tough enough to engage in this conflict. They're not taking this war as seriously or as determinedly as they should be. So that's what I think has happened. There were clearly Ukrainian attacks. The Russian Defense Ministry says that they were repelled. They seem to have been on a fairly big scale. They were probably more than probing attacks, but if this was an attempted offensive, then even if we allow for a degree of exaggeration from the Russian side, the offensive, if this was intended to result in the start of some kind of Ukrainian offensive around Bakhmut, it appears, at least for the moment, to have been unsuccessful, and the Ukrainians were pushed back, and the defenses around Bakhmut, the Russian army defenses, have held. Now, in the meantime, Prigozhin has not been silent, and yesterday he made a statement. He said that Russian forces, the Wagner forces, now had only 630 meters to advance before Bakhmut was entirely cleared. Yesterday, I said that another Wagner soldier had told Novosti, the Russian Novosti news agency, that the Russians had 740 meters to advance. Prigozhin, over the course of the day, says that that had fallen to 630 meters. Then he came out and made a further statement later in the evening, sometime after all these reports were circulating about fighting on the flanks. He said that the situation was that the Russian forces, that the Wagner forces had advanced 220 meters in Bakhmut over the course of the day, which would be a very, very significant advance indeed, and which suggests, by the way, that the Russian forces have pushed further beyond those 630 meters that he was talking about previously. And he made a rather vivid metaphor. He said that the Russian forces in Bakhmut advance forward like a horse in blinkers. In other words, they are not paying any attention to what is taking place on their flanks. All of which may be true or may not. I don't know. Anyway, today he has extended an invitation to Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, of whom he has been bitterly critical. He's invited Shoigu to come to Bakhmut and to inspect the situation for himself and to meet with Prigozhin there. And his statement reads, on the flanks of the Wagner private military company, where the units of the Russian armed forces are located, the enemy launched a number of successful counterattacks given the difficult operational situation, as well as your many years of experience in combat operations. I ask you to come to the territory of Bakhmut, which is under the control of the paramilitary units of the Russian Federation, and independently assess the current situation. Now, there is a studied insult of Shoigu here, because, of course, as Prigozhin knows, when he talks to Shoigu about your many years of experience in combat operations, he knows perfectly well, as everybody in Russia does, that Shoigu is a civilian. He's never been a military commander himself and has never pretended to be. He is the civilian head of Russia's defense ministry. And I have to say, the frankly insulting way in which this message has been made, which contrasts the way in which the territory of Bakhmut is under the control of the paramilitary units of the Russian Federation, with the supposedly successful counterattacks of the Ukrainian forces on the flanks where the Russian regular armed forces are located. I have to say, I think that this message is most unlikely to be well received by Shoigu and will probably dissuade him from accepting Prigozhin's invitation, which I think is a pity. I think personally that Shoigu ought to go to Bakhmut. I think he ought to have a word with Prigozhin there. I think he should indeed inspect the situation, and I think he should bring some senior military commanders with him as well. But having said that, this is a deeply insulting statement, and I'm sure that Prigozhin knows perfectly well that Shoigu is not going to accept it. All of this, again, contrasts with the comments from Abdi Alaudinov, the Chechen officer whose force, the Ahmet Special Forces Unit, is now integrated into the Second Corps of the Lugansk militia. Anyway, Alaudinov, in contrast to Prigozhin, yesterday was giving statements which were clearly intended to calm the whole situation down. I'm going to just make one observation about this. I mean, again, let me reiterate, I am not on location. I don't know exactly what is going on. Prigozhin has been repeatedly talking up reports of a crisis on the flanks of the Russian grouping, the Wagner grouping in Bakhmut. He's been doing this for weeks now, and he's been constantly talking about the risk to the Wagner organization of a Ukrainian counterattack. He has endlessly, ceaselessly, ever since February, been complaining about a shell shortage. The Ukrainian counteroffensive that he's talking about has not so far happened, unless the events that we experienced yesterday were the Ukrainian counterattack, and that seems unlikely. This does seem to have been a major probing attack, but the Russian Defense Ministry has basically said that it didn't achieve anything of significant importance. There might have been some Ukrainian advances in some places, but there have been also Russian advances in other places. And as for the shell shortage, well, I discussed in previous videos that the Ukrainians themselves say that they've seen no sign of any slackening of Russian artillery fire in the Bakhmut area or of Russian bombing attacks in the Bakhmut area. So there is some reason to be skeptical about what Prigozhin says. But at the same time, and I have to say this, it could be that when he says that there is a gathering danger to the flanks of the Wagner force that is advancing in Bakhmut, it could be that he is correct. I mean, this was a big attack by recent standards by the Ukrainian military yesterday. Maybe they were testing the Russian defenses to see whether the kind of things that Prigozhin is constantly talking about are true. If so, then the Russian forces, if one believes the Russian Ministry of Defense, have apparently shown that Prigozhin's warnings are not true and not to be taken fully seriously. But who's to know? Maybe the Ukrainians are indeed planning something, and the situation, if not perhaps as catastrophically bad as Prigozhin is saying, maybe there are serious problems. Maybe there are indeed serious weaknesses on the flanks. From my distance in London, I cannot say, but overall, I have to say that I do think that Valtersen's comment that, all of this panic is misplaced, are probably true. And notice that Valtersen has a military background, which of course I don't. Now that's going to lead me to another observation, and it is a really troubling one. And I don't want to push this too far because I don't know. But Valtersen talks about the fact that an atmosphere of panic was circulating yesterday, and I can't help but wonder whether one of the reasons for this nervous and panicky atmosphere that he's talking about, over and above the points he makes, the disappointment about the Russian failure to make big advances over the course of the winter, the points I've been making, the shock about the successful Ukrainian offensives in the autumn, whether the other, and in fact the principal reason for the nervousness is in fact Prigozhin's behavior. The fact that he's been going around for weeks now talking up a potential crisis to the flanks of his force, his attacking force, the Wagner organization force in Bakhmut. And in fact, I'm going to say straight away that I am sure this is the single biggest cause for this nervousness. And we can see, if these reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense are correct, the damage that Prigozhin's comments have been making, because where there ought to be confidence and stability, there's clearly nervousness, and he's played a key role in generating it, or so it seems to me. And now to come to what I think is the particularly concerning point in this whole affair. I'm sorry to say, though I want to stress I don't believe that this is true, but I'm sorry to say that I am fairly sure that there are some people in the Russian Defense Ministry who, if those reports of Ukrainian breakthroughs last night were indeed groundless, there will be some people in the Russian Defense Ministry who will think that perhaps it was Prigozhin himself who was behind these rumors and who circulated these rumors in order to undermine the credibility of the Russian Defense Ministry and of its regular forces. Now, I want to stress, I think that Prigozhin is an extraordinary personality. I don't believe that he is capable of this. I don't think this is what he would have done. But I do think that things are now so bad between Prigozhin and the Defense Ministry that I suspect that there are some people in the Russian Defense Ministry who now think it. Anyway, there we are. If it is indeed the case, as Prigozhin claims, that the Russians have advanced another 220 meters in Bakhmut, which I suspect is indeed the case, he's reliable, consistently reliable in reporting his own advances, the Wagner forces' advances, then there cannot realistically be much left of Bakhmut to capture. We will see what happens. Lots of fighting going on. no doubt, in Bakhmut. We'll see what happens over the course of today, whether the Ukrainians, after the bruising the Russian Defense Ministry tells us they received last night, and do go back on the attack, and whether, if the Wagner forces did indeed advance with the speed that Prigozhin claims, whether more of Bakhmut will be captured by them over the course of today. Of course, if they achieve a further advance of 220 meters, there'll be hardly anything left to take. But anyway, these are questions which we will have to discuss. I will have to discuss tomorrow. This bitter feud between Prigozhin and the Defense Ministry, as I've said previously, taking this comment from Simplicius the thinker, he's the person who coined this phrase, it leaves a very, very bad taste in the mouth. And I think last night we saw some of the consequences of it. Now, the fighting, as I said, didn't just happen in Bakhmut last night. There's been fighting in many other places. The Russian military were in operation. They were launching missile strikes and air strikes and drone strikes right across Ukraine. And alongside all of this, there was a very interesting comment made by an anonymous official, senior official of the Russian aerospace forces to the TASS news agency, the Russian TASS news agency. It hasn't been widely picked up, but I do think it is interesting. Now, this all flows from this extraordinary claim that Ukraine has made and then retracted and then made again about the Ukrainians shooting down a Kinjal hypersonic missile. Now, the Ukrainian Air Defense Command has, as I've discussed previously and as Brian Beletic has discussed at very great length, vigorously denied this claim. They have said repeatedly, many times, in multiple formats, that they did not shoot down a Kinjal hypersonic missile. They lack the ability to do that. Their air defense system lacks the capability to shoot down hypersonic missiles. Nonetheless, other Ukrainian officials have persisted with this story, and over the last couple of hours, there was a grotesque episode in Kiev where Kiev's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, one of the two Klitschko brothers, an outstanding boxer and at one time a prominent politician, but perhaps not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Anyway, he displayed to various journalists, I believe principally from the German publication Bild Zeitung, what he said was the debris of this Kinjal hypersonic missile, which Klitschko and some Ukrainian officials say Ukraine shot down, but which the Ukrainian air defense themselves emphatically and categorically denied that they did shoot down. The problem is that the debris that Klitschko showed was most obviously not that of a hypersonic Kinjal missile. Most Russian reports, in fact all Russian reports, say that what was displayed was the debris of a BTAB 500 concrete piercing bomb. In other words, a gravity bomb, something completely different from a hypersonic missile. I mean, I'm not able to comment on that. All I will say is, even with my vision issues, I saw the pictures of what Klitschko was displaying. I've seen photos of an actual Kinjal missile, it's obvious to me, even to my inexpert eyes, that what Klitschko was parading was not, by any stretch, the debris of a Kinjal missile. Anyway, this grotesque episode resulted in this anonymous official of the Russian Air Force contacting TASS and giving TASS certain information about the Russian missile offensive against Ukraine. And the first part of it is something we already know. He said that Ukraine doesn't possess the capability of shooting down hypersonic missiles like the Kinjal, and they didn't shoot down a Kinjal. That, I think, is widely accepted. In that respect, he didn't tell us anything new. But this official also went on to say something completely different, something entirely new, something which I've never heard before. He said that the Ukrainians routinely claim to have shot down more cruise missiles than the Russians have actually launched in any missile attack. Now, that is very interesting because all the information I've seen about the number of missiles that the Russians have launched against Ukraine on any particular day have come from Ukrainian sources. When we had the big missile strikes over the course of the winter, for example, it was regularly claimed by the Ukrainians that the Russians were launching anything from up to 80 to 100 cruise missiles a day, and that the Ukrainians were shooting down on average around 90% of them. The Russians never said how many cruise missiles they actually launched against Ukraine on any particular day. And the entire theory about Russia running out of cruise missiles and having its arsenals depleted was based on two assumptions. One was that the Russians had limited stocks of these missiles and could not produce these missiles in numbers to replace expended missiles. And the second was on Ukrainian claims about the number of missiles that were being launched. Well, what if what this official says is true? What if the Russians actually launched significantly fewer missiles on any particular day than the Ukrainians were claiming? Not only would Ukrainian claims to have shot down cruise missiles have been wrong by orders of magnitude, but the Russians would have been using fewer missiles, depleting their stocks of missiles less than the Ukrainians were asserting. Anyway, this is what this official said. I can't comment on it further, but I do think it is an interesting claim and one that hasn't been noticed much by the West. This official also went on to say that the reason that the Ukrainians make these claims about huge numbers of, dozens, scores of Russian cruise missiles launched against them on any particular day is because the Ukrainians are over-expending ammunition. They're launching many more air defense missiles than they ought to be using, presumably because they can't actually shoot many of these missiles, Russian cruise missiles, down. And they want to explain away and justify to the West their overuse of ammunition, and they do that by inflating the numbers of Russian cruise missiles that are fired at them. Well, that's what this Russian official said. It is anonymous. I don't have any independent corroboration of it. I think it's interesting. It's also plausible. We'll have to one day wait after the war is over and we have more precise numbers in order to arrive at a conclusion about what actually happened. What's actually happened over the course of these missile attacks. Anyway, there was, as I said, a big Russian missile attack. There were also Russian advances in the Avdiivka area. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense also talks about Russian advances in Marinka. I'm not going to devote more time to this. There's been so much talk about Russian advances in Marinka. It's clearly an advance that's taking place there at the rate of a snail. But in Avdiivka, I have to say, I saw a map produced by the Rebar group, which showed the situation in Avdiivka. And I should say maps by the Rebar collective have, in my experience, been pretty accurate. And this map, if it is accurate, shows a very dangerous situation for the Ukrainians indeed. Because, to be frank, if this map is correct, then Avdiivka, this town of around 30,000 people before the war, which is said to be the major Ukrainian defense position near Donetsk city, Avdiivka is now practically surrounded. And its situation must be very rapidly approaching the kind of crisis level that Ukraine has been experiencing in Bakhmut over the last few weeks. And Russian advances in the Avdiivka area perhaps have been faster than some reports have been suggesting. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. So, overall, all quiet on the Ukrainian fronts. A big Ukrainian attack in and around Bakhmut. The Russian Defense Ministry says comprehensively repelled with heavy losses. Prigozhin seems to dispute that, but at the same time he's claiming that the Wagner forces continue to advance in Bakhmut. And some evidence of very significant Russian advances in Avdiivka, though in the absence of someone like Prigozhin, little direct information about what is actually going on there. So that's the situation on the Ukrainian battlefields as of this morning. As it's obvious, this is a dramatic and very fluid situation. Things can change from 1 hour to the next. As I had to say over the course of my video yesterday, it could be that by the time this video is published, the information I've provided in this video will be out of date. But I can only do what I can do. I can only publish information as it's been reported as of the time of the making of this video, and well, there it is. Now, lots of things going on elsewhere in the world, and before I proceed, I want to thank a number of people who've written to me about the Storm Shadow missile, people with very different views about this missile, I should say. I do want to make one very quick observation about it, and it's one that perhaps needs to be reiterated. I don't think that the Russians are underestimating the potential threat from this missile at all, but I would make a number of points which have also been made to me, and I ought to make it clear this is all information. Everything I've said about the Storm Shadow comes from multiple sources, which I can't really comment or discuss. But anyway, one point I would make is that it is a subsonic cruise missile with a terrain following capability. The Russian air defenses have been geared towards countering precisely this kind of threat since at least the 1970s, the late 1970s, when the original Tomahawk cruise missile with its terrain following guidance first appeared. And the original MiG-31 fighter jet, for example, appeared precisely in order to counter threats like this, and I can't myself believe that in the decades that have passed, the Russian air defenses haven't improved upon what they'd already achieved in the late 1970s and early 1990s. So yes, undoubtedly, it is a problem for the Russians. All of these missiles are problems for the Russians, but I doubt that it is quite the game changer that people imagine. In that, I should say that it reminds me a bit of the HIMARS. Fairly effective at the beginning. It degraded very rapidly. The United States says that Ukraine is now only launching around 18 of these missiles a day. Interesting fact in itself, which I might return to in a future program. Of these, only a proportion gets through because the Russians not only are able to jam them, but because they've been able to find ways of shooting them down. So that is what I think about the Storm Shadow. Some of them might get through, some of them might cause real damage, some of them might cause damage to the Kerch Bridge, but I doubt that it is the game changer that some people appear to believe. But in the meantime, lots of things are continuing to take place around the world. There is the election in Turkey, which is going to take place, I believe, on Sunday. It seems to be a very tight race. I've seen contradictory reports about who is ahead in the opinion polls. Seem to be different opinion polls now coming from different sources, but clearly this is the toughest challenge that President Erdogan has ever faced in his very long career. We'll see whether he's able to win through, and we'll also see, if he does win through, whether his victory is accepted. I know that there are some people who think the same. If at the end of the election it is his opponent who seems to have inched ahead, we'll see whether Erdogan accepts it. One thing I would say is that I understand that this election is in 2 rounds, and given how tight the race looks, I think there's a reasonable chance that it might go through to a second round. So this may not be over quickly. Anyway, that's the first thing to say. The other big news is what has happened in Pakistan. And this has been a long-running story, but there were major protests in Pakistan following the sudden arrest of the former Prime Minister and opposition leader Imran Khan. And it does seem as if the Pakistani authorities underestimated the popular reaction to Imran Khan's arrest, to the point where it looked briefly as if they might be in actual danger of losing control of the country. Protests were on an enormous scale. The military had to be called out to try to contain them. It looked as if the military was struggling to do so. And I have to say, for a short time, it started to look as if there might be a major political even revolutionary crisis in Pakistan. Anyway, the situation has now been diffused by the Pakistani Supreme Court, which has announced that Imran Khan's arrest was illegal, which presumably means that he's now been released and that the situation there has presumably calmed in consequence of that. I can't help but think that this episode politically has worked to Imran Khan's advantage, but it comes at a time when the political situation in Pakistan is, to put it mildly, extremely volatile indeed, with the economy in Pakistan in a very, very bad way. I don't think that this crisis is over, and given that Pakistan is a nuclear power with nuclear weapons, if this crisis escalates further, if some means isn't found to resolve it permanently, then we could very well be finding ourselves in a crisis with Pakistan, which is actually more serious than the crisis we're seeing in Ukraine itself. So, just to make that point, two big events coming, an election in Turkey, an ongoing and arguably deepening crisis in Pakistan. In the meantime, and this now brings me back to the confrontation between Russia and the West, two incredibly bitter articles about the failure of the sanctions war against Russia have just appeared in the British media. And they've appeared in two publications, both of which are very close in some respects to the Conservative Party. One is The Spectator magazine, Britain's leading right-of-centre magazine, once edited by no less a person than Boris Johnson. The other, The Daily Telegraph, of which Boris Johnson used to be, and perhaps will once again become, a leading columnist. So you can see some of the threads, the connecting threads. But anyway, let's first of all go to the Spectator, because it talks about the failure of the sanctions, and it says why the economic war against Russia has failed, and it then talks about the fact that the West, the article says, I'm not going to read it, it's behind all of it, it's behind a paywall. It says that the West, when they began a confrontation with Russia in February 2022, they had a two-pronged strategy. One was to support Ukraine militarily. The second was to try to crush Russia economically through sanctions. And it then says that the economic prong has turned out to be blunt. The plan to wage economic war with Moscow, unleashing financial shock and awe. The plan was to wage, economic war with Moscow, unleashing financial shock and awe on a scale never seen before. I want to just say something about that, because I think that the expression financial shock and awe sanctions was actually first made by us on the Duran back in February and March 2022. So it's interesting to see that it's now extended to the Spectator. Whether they took it from us or whether they came up with it themselves, I'm not going to try and guess. And it then goes on to say Russia was to be cut off almost entirely with sanctions and boycotts on all imports and exports, save for humanitarian ones such as medicines. Putin's Russia, went the theory, would be impoverished into surrender. Few people in the West are aware of how badly this aspect of the war is going. And then the article discusses how the European economy has suffered a bad effect from the sanctions, but Russia, on the contrary, has managed to sustain itself, and that in April last year, the IMF forecast that the Russian economy would contract by 8.5% in 2022 and by a further 2.3% this year. As it turned out, GDP fell by just 2.1% last year, and this year the IMF is forecasting a small rise of 0.7%. In fact, as I said in a recent video, the Russian economics ministry is now being more optimistic. It thinks that the expansion will continue. And the article in The Spectator attributes this resilience of the Russian economy to the fact that other countries around the world, principally China and India, refused to join the sanctions. And it ends, the Russian economy has not been destroyed, it has merely been reconfigured, reorienting to look eastwards and southwards rather than westwards. And then there is a then it goes on to make a further sour point. It was not necessarily wrong to declare economic war on Russia. It's an interesting thing to say after the admission that the economic war has been a failure and has arguably done more harm to Western economies than the Russian one. But anyway, and then it goes on to say that the country has suffered harm from Western sanctions, even if nothing like on the scale that we imagined we could inflict. But if the West is thinking that in future it can fight wars purely by economic means without bombs or bullets, it is badly mistaken. Western military equipment has allowed Ukraine to mount a David versus Goliath battle, which it may yet win, and certainly to avoid annexation by Putin. Well, might also lose, but I'm not going to go there. But then it goes on to say and finish, as for economic sanctions, however, we will have to think again. So that's The Spectator. The article in The Telegraph is much more bitter, and it is by the editor, I believe, of the Sunday Telegraph, the Sunday newspaper, Alistair Heath. I might be wrong about him having an editorial role, but he is certainly one of its lead commentators. And by the way, this article, as far as I know, predates the article in The Spectator. So the content is so similar in some respects that I can't quite bring myself to believe that the two articles aren't in some way connected, given, as I said, the close proximity between these two news outlets. Anyway, this article is also behind a paywall, so I'm not going to read it all, but it says Russia was meant to have collapsed by now. Britain, America, and Europe's gambit was the drastic trade, financial, and technological sanctions, a cap on the price of Russian seaborne oil, and substantial help to Ukraine would be enough to defeat Moscow. It hasn't worked. For all of the sacrifices of the Ukrainian people, the war has reached a stalemate, at least until Kiev's counteroffensive. Well, we won't talk about that. The reason China has quietly stepped in, bailing out Putin's shattered economy on a transformational scale, swapping energy and raw materials for goods and technology. The sanctions are a joke. Russia-Chinese trade rose 43.1% in the first 4 months of the year to $73 billion, financing Putin's war. China's exports to Russia were up 153% in April 2023 alone. Their rise more than cancels out the decline in German and French trade, as Robin Brooks, the Institute for International Finance, points out. China's trade has also shot up with Belarus, Kazakhstan, Georgia and Turkey, all with easy, porous access to China. No wonder Russian society hasn't imploded. There may no longer be any McDonald's in Moscow, but sales of Chinese cars are buoyant. We were told Russia couldn't survive without Western technology, but it is instead switching to China's rival systems. Well, it's all China's fault, apparently. It's all the rest of the world's fault. The rest of the world wasn't prepared to follow the Western lead, isolate Russia. And the result is our great sanctions cannon has turned out to be a pea shooter. In fact, worse than a pea shooter, because it's backfired on us. Very interesting admissions in the British media from, as I said, media outlets historically close to the British Conservative Party and therefore to the British government. Well, on one level, it is a recognition of the obvious. At another level, I have to say, it is a belated recognition of reality. Sanctions against Russia were never a good idea. And the idea that the rest of the world would unite behind the West and be bullied and intimidated by the West into supporting sanctions was a foolish one. But what these articles, if you drill them down, grudgingly acknowledge is something else, which explains the bitterness you find behind them. 20, 30 years ago, the Western powers dominated the world economy. If they'd imposed sanctions on Russia or on any other country outside the collective West, the effect would have been ruinous. The world has changed. Other economic players have grown in scale. China today now has a manufacturing capacity greater than that of the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. India is becoming a major economy in its own right. Brazil also. The days of Western economic dominance are fading. These articles are the first grudging admission in Britain that that is the case, where economic dominance fails, political dominance in time fails. Also, these articles are in effect an implicit admission of the decline of the West. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. I hope you find this all fairly useful. In the meantime, just to say, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. Links under this video. Please also remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. All the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Links under this video also, by the way. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. More from me soon. Have a very good day.